Hi guys, I am Rachel. I'm a Messianic Jew. I recently went viral talking about the struggles as a Messianic Jew and quickly realized that I am not a theology expert. Theologian. I am just a girl that likes to yap, and I'm a Jew. And I have strong opinions, and I could be sassy. But I want to invite the experts on my channel to talk about these very big things that can sometimes feel a little bit complicated and overwhelming. So that is why we have two Messianic Jews right here with us today. And this is an exciting day. I'm so glad that they're here to be on my page as my first guest because they are the experts in theology. So let me give you a quick bio about them before we get started. Two Messianic Jews YouTube and podcast is a resource for the Messianic Jewish community and for anyone interested in understanding the New Testament in its original Jewish context. Their goal is to correct anti-Jewish and replacement theology interpretations of the New Testament that have harmed Jewish-Christian relations for centuries and to respond to Jewish objections to the New Testament to clarify the Jewishness of what it teaches. Through this work, their aim is to strengthen the faith and identity of Messianic Jews and deepen biblical and historical understanding for all who listen and watch. Jonathan, who has the hat on in the bottom screen, he has a Master of Theological Studies in New Testament from Duke University. And Eric at the top, he has his Master's in Theological Studies in New Testament at Emory University. So, well-studied, well-educated men. And before we get started, I just want to also say that this is a really special live because we are going live on Yom HaShoah. I'm pretty sure I did not pronounce that correctly, but it's basically Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day. Hold on, I have something written down about that. Give me a second. We as Jews deal with persecution on the regular. There's anti-Semitism rampant, especially now after October 7th. But not long ago, we went through the Holocaust as a people, and it is a miracle that me and Jonathan and Eric are literally sitting here as Jews talking about these issues, and what Hitler tried to destroy didn't work because God. Since God has, this is actually a testament to God's faithfulness. Oh, hi, dog. So it's actually a testament to God's faithfulness because God has kept his promises to the Jews, kept us a people, and we're a small people. We're a small people, and he has still kept his promises to us, kept us as a people. And because he's done that and kept his promises, Christians can also trust that he will do the same for them. Although we go through struggles and persecution, whenever we go through these struggles, Jews unite, and we see our what unites us, and instead of what divides us. So it's a very special day. Let's get started. Thank you to Messianic Jews for being here. Would you like to say anything before we get started?
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here, and we watched your video and saw how viral it's getting, and I'm really glad, Rachel, that you put out this content and kind of explaining where you're coming from as a Messianic Jew.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David, for figuring this out.
Yes, husband to the rescue.
Yeah, appreciate it, David.
Okay, great. So let's get started on the questions. Now I took my viral video questions and kind of like used ChatGPT's help and narrowed down like the most popular questions that were asked. So the first one we're going to start with is, are Messianic Jews Jewish or Christian or both? And that's ethnically and religiously.
Yeah, so just to kind of give you some context here. So Messianic Jews are Jewish followers of Jesus who followed Jesus as the Messiah and continue to live as Jews. And so when I say we're Jewish, it means that my mother is Jewish, and being a Jew is you're a physical descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Actually, both my parents are Jewish, and some of the things that Messianic Jews, kind of the core things that we believe, because you asked us about religiously, we believe that God is the creator of all that exists and the God of our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We affirm the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. We affirm God's unity, that God is the creator of all that exists, and he exists as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We believe that Jesus, who we call by his Hebrew name, Yeshua, is Lord, that he's the divine Messiah who died for our sins and rose from the dead. We affirm God's covenant with Israel and the calling that God has for Jewish people to live Jewish lives. That calling is what Paul says is irrevocable. And we obey the commandments that God gave Israel to make us distinct as Israel. So, for example, we don't eat pork or shellfish. We rest on Shabbat. We celebrate the Jewish holidays. Jewish parents will circumcise their boys on the 8th day. And we embrace Jewish traditions like reciting liturgy in our Shabbat service. We have Shabbat dinners as families. We just came out of Passover, having Passover Seders. Some of us will put on tefillin, like myself and Eric. Wear a talit in the mornings, or going into shul, synagogue. We celebrate in the synagogue. We celebrate Shabbat, the Jewish holidays. And this kind of provides a little bit of context for everyone here listening and watching about like what exactly are Messianic Jews.
Yeah, so all those, first and foremost, we're Jewish people, we're Jewish men, born of Jewish mothers. And all the beliefs and the behaviors, the religious practices that Jonathan just described are Jewish, either explicitly, something like tefillin, for example, or our beliefs are Jewish, something like believing that God is the creator of all that exists, and he gave promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then those beliefs that some would say make us a Christian, so to speak, like Yeshua, Jesus being Lord, we would argue fits within the spectrum of Jewish beliefs, theologically and historically, and we would argue that you can ground those beliefs ultimately in the Jewish scripture, the Tanakh, and that similar beliefs have been held by the Jewish people throughout time. So in that sense, both ethnically and religiously, we are Jewish. Sometimes it takes a little bit of arguing and explaining to make our case, but I think that we have a strong case for it. And I guess to make it a little bit more like personal, so to speak, considering all that Jonathan just described about what we believe and the way we live our lives being Jewish people, what I have found is that ultimately the reason why I call myself a Messianic Jew instead of a Christian is because for me, Messianic Jew is simply a more accurate label for who I am, what I believe, my way of life, than the label of Christian. So Christian does not merely convey I believe in Jesus. It also conveys, especially within the Jewish community, Christian conveys that I'm a Gentile. But I'm not a Gentile. So that's a point of discontinuity between that label and who I am. It also conveys behavioral things, like that I'm a member of a church and I go every Sunday, or that I eat Christmas ham every year. But I'm not a member of a church and I don't eat ham. So that would be an inaccurate label to place on myself. And then the label Christian also fails to convey that I am Jewish. It also fails to convey that I had a bar mitzvah, or that I celebrate the Jewish holidays, or rest on Shabbat. And so Messianic Jew, to me, clearly conveys that I'm a Jewish person who follows the Messiah and that I continue to live a Jewish life. So it is essentially just like a more accurate and precise label for my ethnic and religious identity that I think if I were to use the label Christian, that I'd actually be being not entirely forthcoming, or maybe even bordering on the edge of dishonest. And just like one kind of last note, all of this is especially within the context of meeting many Jews who are Christians, and kind of like including that sociological sense. So when I talk to Jewish people who are Anglican or Catholic or Greek Orthodox, like I feel very different from them. Like they are Christians, you know. Even when they still claim to assert, and assert and engage with their Jewish identities, which I'm very grateful for, they will still call themselves Christians, but they'll say Jewish Christians. So they still kind of take that label, but the Christian label is accurate to their religious way of life. For like they'll do Lent, for example, or Ash Wednesday, Good Friday. And so when I'm, especially with those Jewish Christians, I feel a need to accurately distinguish myself because I'm so different from them. So those are a lot of the reasons why I almost can't help but use the label Messianic Jew instead of Christian for a pure accuracy point of view.
Those are great answers. I have struggled in the past when I meet like another mom at the park and they're like, where do you go to church? And I always try to, I want to say that I'm a Messianic Jew, but sometimes I'm like, that it's going to be a whole like talk about this. So I sometimes want to just be like somebody else, but I can't. And I've really tried to really appreciate that about myself and embrace that more and not see it as much as like someone is trying to act like I'm a museum, but actually see it as a blessing. And I think that our differences are blessings and we have different roles as Jews and Christians. So I think it's really good to keep our identity in Messianic Judaism. That's a great answer, you guys. Let's get started on question number 2, which is, do we believe that Jesus, or Yeshua, which is Jesus in Hebrew, is fully divine and fully human?
Absolutely. Yeah, we do. And I think some good passages of scripture to kind of that we point in this direction as Jewish people who believe that Yeshua, Jesus, is fully divine, fully human. If you go to Luke chapter 2, verse 10 through 11, we read here, and the angel said to them, speaking to the shepherds, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, that there will be for all the people, for unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Messiah the Lord. Now, the reason I bring that up is because it emphasizes Yeshua's humanity, that he was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, as this Davidic Messiah, a descendant of David, that he's the Messiah, he's born, but also that he's Lord. In Greek, this word for Lord is kurios, and it's the Greek translation of what we find in the Tanakh for what we call Adonai, or in synagogue Hashem. So like, for example, Isaiah 52, verse 7 through 8, where the gospel is already proclaimed in the book of Isaiah. We read how Isaiah says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation. The word there is Yeshua, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy, for eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. So this idea of the Lord returning to Zion, this good news, or what's often called gospel, is Yeshua returning to his people. It's really, when you read the Bible and understanding it through a Jewish context, as Eric and I do, and as many Messianic Jews do, we really see that the emphasis that Yeshua is Lord throughout. One other text I really appreciated is Romans 10, where Paul says in verse 9, if you confess with your mouth that Yeshua is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And then skipping to verse 13, Paul quotes from the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 32, where it says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, applying the Lord, that title, to Yeshua. So yes, we as Messianic Jews affirm Yeshua is fully human and fully divine.
Yeah, so this is one of those beliefs that somebody may say, oh, see, you're a Christian because you believe that Jesus is Lord, that he's part of the Trinity. And so this is where we would argue that this actually does fit within what we call like the spectrum of Jewish beliefs. And first, from a historical perspective, here's a really great quote from Dr. Daniel Boyarin. So he's a professor, I believe, UC Berkeley. Is that right, Jonathan? UC Berkeley? That's right.
Yeah.
He does rabbinics. He's an Orthodox Jewish scholar, so he's not a Messianic Jew. He does not believe in Jesus. But he's done a lot of research on historical Jewish beliefs when it comes to God and Messiah figures. And in Here's a quote from the book, from his article, Enoch, Ezra, and the Jewishness of High Christology. He says, the road to Nicaea, so the Council of Nicaea, where the doctrine of the incarnation, of God taking on human flesh is kind of articulated in the 4th century. The road to Nicaea had been well cleared and paved, and neither Trinity nor incarnation can be said to represent a departure from Israelite religion, but rather an unfolding of it. Jews came to believe that Jesus was God because they already believed that the Messiah would be a divine redeemer incarnated in a human being. They just argued about who that human being was. And then in this article, he references primary sources, Jewish sources that date even before the time of Yeshua to demonstrate that claim. But that's like an incredible claim that the doctrine of the Trinity is simply an unfolding of Israelite religion. And as Jonathan was just showing, we see it in the Tanakh itself, this view of God being connected to the Messiah, and there's plenty more to be said about that. So from a historical perspective, our belief in Yeshua being Lord fits within Judaism. But then even in a modern theological context of acceptable Jewish beliefs, we would argue that it fits comfortably within the spectrum that has been set by non-Messianic Jewish community. So there's different views of God within Judaism. There's not just one view of God within Judaism. And I mean, in one sense, we all, like, you're allowed to be a Jew who doesn't believe that God even exists. So that should give us some flexibility right there.
Or a Buddhist Jew.
Yeah, or a Buddhist Jew.
Yeah.
But even within the modern religious Jewish system, there's a wide spectrum of views of God. So for example, on one end, there's Kabbalah. So it's kind of Jewish mysticism. It's heavily influenced by Eastern philosophical thought. If it's not influenced by, at least shares a lot of the same tenets and beliefs. And that holds a panentheist view of God. So panentheist is different than pantheist, but it's kind of one step away. So pantheism is the belief that everything is God. So like the universe is God, for example. Panentheism is a little bit of a nuanced view of that. They'll say everything is in God. So kind of the classic image connected to that is kind of like the universe is in God's womb, so to speak. So everything in the universe has God in it, but God is kind of still bigger than the universe. But it's a very tangible view of God. Everything has the spark of the divine in it. You might hear a Kabbalist say, we all have a divine spark in us, even in our souls, in our neshamas. So that's one end of the spectrum that's accepted within Judaism. Kabbalah is a very accepted belief within Judaism. Then on the very far opposite end is Maimonides' view of God. So Maimonides, he's probably the most influential Jewish philosopher ever. He was a medieval philosopher in I think the 11th century from Spain, and his view of God is nearly deistic. So a deist view of God is that God pretty much created the world and then took a step back and he's uninvolved. Maimonides' view of God is a little bit more involved, but it's still this view, to keep it on simple terms, that Maimonides would say you can't state anything positive about God because he's so incomprehensible, he's so distant from us, he's so much larger and so far away from where we are that we can't state anything like we can't say that he is good. We can't say that he is loving because that would be claiming to know something about God. So we can only state things in the negative, like he is not evil, for example. But it's this idea of God that is so distant that it would be impossible for God to interact with humankind in any way. And so that's entirely incompatible with the Kabbalistic view, where Kabbalistic view will say everything here is God, in some sense, is in God. But Maimonides would argue harshly against that, say, no, that's impossible because God and creation are so far apart. So that creates a very wide spectrum of acceptable beliefs. So they'll argue with each other, but that's kind of like the range that's been accepted. Mm-hmm. The Trinitarian view falls somewhere in the middle, right? So we'll say that God is distinct from creation, unlike Kabbalah, but just like Maimonides. But we would say that it's possible for him to enter into creation and take on human flesh like the person of Jesus. So that's unlike Maimonides, but somewhat similar to Kabbalah. So we actually kind of take a middle view within this very wide range of Jewish beliefs. And of course, when you get grounded in the text, like Jonathan was before, that really helps. And also historically speaking, what's been expressed in Jewish texts as well. So that's a little higher level. Hopefully that clicked in some way. I probably could have done a better job explaining it, but for that reason, we would argue that that's a Jewish belief.
Yeah.
No, you did a great job. Oh, Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing to kind of help kind of summarize it a little bit. So our belief that Yeshua is divine is rooted really in the Tanakh itself, in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. When we look at passages like Genesis 18 or Daniel chapter 7, that's a very big one. But also Jewish people around the time of Jesus who were producing Jewish literature were arguing that the Messiah is divine. And then what Eric was saying today, we even see Jewish views where we would fall within the range of the Jewish spectrum. But one of the things I think that is missed a lot of times in these conversations is the conversations that are happening in the universities and academia in these big books that people are arguing about this stuff. So I'll read one comment by Dr. Benjamin Sommer, and he is professor of Hebrew Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which ordains conservative rabbis. He says, in his book, The Bodies of God, page 135, no Jew sensitive to Judaism's own classical sources, however, can fault the theological model Christianity employs when it avows belief in a God who has an earthly body as well as a Holy Spirit and a heavenly manifestation. For that model we have seen is a perfectly Jewish one. And he's saying that not as a Messianic Jew, but as a Hebrew Bible scholar, expert in rabbinics and in the Hebrew Bible itself, and he's saying that Jewish people shouldn't have problems with the idea of the incarnation or the Trinity. So it's good to keep that in mind when we're approaching this stuff. The book that if you want to look deeper into this on what Eric was saying about Kabbalah and Maimonides, Dr. Brian Crawford just came out with a book called The Scandal of the Divine Messiah. That just came out, deals with this. And then I have one right here. It's called The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ by Dr. Daniel Boyarin.
Yeah, you can get Brian's book at brianjcrawford.com.
Yep.
Awesome. That is so great. Okay, that was a great answer to that question, you guys. The next one was one of the top questions in my video and then other videos after that I made, which is, why do Messianic Jews still follow the Old Testament law if we now believe in Yeshua and we're free to just do whatever we want?
Yeah, see, this question is asked all the time, especially when I define Messianic Jew as someone who lives a Jewish life. It's like, why keep on doing that?
Right.
Well, so basically it comes down to this. God calls the Jewish people to live a Jewish way of life, to live in a way that's obedient to the commandments that God gave Israel to make us distinct. So in the Torah, God called the Jewish people to live a life of obedience to the commandments that God gave Israel. And then we look to the New Testament, there's no change in this expectation. I know people will say that there's a change, but when you actually look at these texts in their Jewish context, you see that there's no change. Actually, starting in the very first book of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, Yeshua in particular, Jesus, he affirms this expectation. So I'll go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 19, where Yeshua says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So right there in the very chapter 5, verse 17, Yeshua says he's not come to abolish the Torah. It's really interesting because this word for abolish in Greek is kataluo. It's the same Greek word that you find in Jewish literature where we learn about Hanukkah from 2nd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees, and the Jewish historian Josephus. And those Jewish writers use this Greek term to describe how Antiochus, this king, the Seleucid king, was trying to abolish the Jewish way of life, and how Jewish people who would rebel against the king, who continue to live in obedience to the commandments, they refuse to abolish the Torah, to abolish their Jewish way of life. So within that context, Yeshua is saying that he's not come to abolish the Torah. He's not come to prevent or stop Jews from keeping the Torah. He actually has come to fulfill it. And that word fulfill, it really carries a sense of establishing or confirming the Torah. He's come to confirm the Torah, to do it rightly. And which is when you keep reading in Matthew chapter 5, Yeshua is teaching how to do the Torah. This question of do Jewish people need, or are Jewish people expected, do they have a responsibility to keeping these commandments? It's actually asked and answered in the New Testament in Acts chapter 21. So in Acts chapter 21, we read this in verse 17. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. This is the next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed in Yeshua, and all of them are zealous for the Torah. They have been informed that you teach all Jews living among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to the customs. What shall we do?" So here, there is a rumor going around that Paul is teaching Jewish people who are living among Gentiles to not circumcise their sons and to stop keeping the commandments. And that rumor is carried out to this day when we get this idea that, Jewish people are free from the law. But he says, what shall we do? And say, they will certainly hear you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. And so we learn here, you keep reading the text, through Paul's action, he actually goes through and performs this sacrifice, performs this Nazirite vow, doing through his action, communicating that he teaches Jewish people, even if they're living in the diaspora, that they are still obligated and responsible to live in accordance with the commandments that God gave Israel. So those are just 2 texts. You can go, there's many more that you can go through, and Eric, I'm sure will share some, that affirm that Jewish people in particular, not all believers, but Jewish people in particular have an expectation to live in obedience to the commandments that make Israel distinct as Israel.
Yeah, so as Jonathan was describing, on one hand, it's simply the example of Yeshua, of Jesus, and the disciples like Paul. And then we also have explicit instruction from people like Paul to continue living a Jewish life. So 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 23 is a really important passage for Messianic Jews, really for all people, but especially for Messianic Jews in this context. It says, "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the congregation." So Paul is introducing this universal rule of living according to the situation that God has assigned you to. And what are those assignments? Verse 18 says, "Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised." So in the Second Temple time period and in the New Testament, we see also the book of Acts and Paul and Romans treat the word circumcision in a way, it doesn't simply refer to the keeping of that one particular command from the Torah. It was a figurative way of speaking to refer to being Jewish and being a Jewish, or living a Jewish way of life as a Jewish person. So for example, when we say the White House, we're referring to the entire executive branch and what the White House represents. Or when we say the crown, it's the monarchy represents the entirety of all of the operations that the monarchy does, or at least the palace and the royal family. And so when Paul, in this context, is using circumcision, he's referring to being Jewish and living a Jewish way of life. And you know that when in Romans 3:1, he says, what is the advantage of being a Jew? What is the advantage of being circumcised? So it's kind of a synonym in those ways. But here he says, if you're a man who's already Jewish when he was called, when he became a believer, he should not become uncircumcised. He should not become a Gentile. He should not take on a Gentile way of life. He should continue keeping those instructions that God gave the Jewish people in particular, like Brit Milah, circumcision, like Shabbat, like the holidays, like wearing tzitzit, and so like keeping kosher and so on. And then moving forward, was a man uncircumcised when he was called? So was he Gentile when he was called? He should not be circumcised. He should not become a Jew. And one of the big messages of the New Testament is that's because Jews and Gentiles have access to God and reconciliation to God through Yeshua as the Messiah, through faith in him. Jews and Gentiles access right relationship with God the same way. Being Jew is no better than being Gentile. Being Gentile is no better than being a Jew. But if God made you a Jew, then be a Jew. If God made you a Gentile, then be a Gentile. And this really mirrors what we see in the book of Acts. Jonathan already read Acts 21, where we see Paul clarifying that he does in fact keep the law. We saw in Acts 21, verse 23. And in Acts 15, there's this big discussion. I'll just read verse 5 in Acts 15:5. It says, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, so these are literally Pharisees who believed in Jesus, stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. So there's this small sect within what was exclusively a Jewish believing community of Yeshua to start out with. Now all these Gentiles are pouring in. These Pharisees who believe, they think, oh, these Gentiles, they're joining a Jewish community, therefore they must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses to join us. So what does that presume? That presumes that Jews must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses, not for salvation, but for being obedient to God. So their conclusion was Gentiles don't need to be circumcised and Gentiles don't need to keep all of the laws of Moses like Jewish people do, because that distinction remains. But all that Acts 15 is presuming is that Jewish people do have to continue to be Jews and keeping the law of Moses. Because otherwise the premise of that conversation doesn't make any sense. If the Jewish people already stopped being Jews and stopped circumcising and stopped keeping the law of Moses once they believed in Jesus, then why would they even ask the question whether Gentiles have to once they started to believe in Jesus? So Acts 15 only makes sense if you presume Jewish responsibility continues. So for those reasons, and we could talk about others, that is why Messianic Jews continue to live a Jewish life that's directed by the Torah.
What a great answer, both of you guys. Thank you so much. That actually is a great lead into our next question, which is kind of like on the other side of the coin, I guess you could say, is what pressures have you felt, if any, from Christians to assimilate or stop practicing Judaism?
Yeah, so I say for me, when I was in elementary school, middle school, I was very proud of my Jewish identity, still am, but I went to a Christian school, so me and my siblings were like the only Jews at the school. And so I guess when it comes to assimilating, it came time when it was like pizza day, right, to eat pepperoni. I had to have an exception, and it would just been a lot easier for other people serving if I just would eat the pepperoni, but I wouldn't. I would get into conversations then and even today when it comes to, well, Jesus declared all foods clean, right? So why are you continuing to abide by these old laws that we're free from? So I think it's mostly when it comes to like what I eat, feeling kind of pressure to assimilate. But I feel even going to school, in grad school, really studying this area and just studying the New Testament more in depth, the more I study it, the more I'm convinced that the passages that both Eric and I were referencing are just very strong, that we really are called, Jewish people really are called by God to continue to hold on to our Jewish identity, live that way. And it's a calling that is really a gift, and really it's a gift, and especially today with all the anti-Semitism that the Jewish community that we're facing, it's really just a sign of just pride in your identity, just to continue living the way our ancestors have lived for all these thousands of years.
Yeah. For me, I haven't faced like incredible pressure. It's usually mostly like theologically inclined people who like care to debate in some manner, or it'll just be a question like, why aren't you just a Christian? Or, but I thought there's no longer Jew or Greek, when we're all in Messiah. And so kind of questions that come from certain interpretations of certain texts that call my identity or my way of life into question. And so it usually involves some sort of theological discussion like that. So for Galatians 3:28, which that's where people's mind tends to first go, where it says there's neither Jew nor Gentile. On one hand, we know that must mean something more specific, because in Acts 26, Paul says, I am a Jew. So Paul considered himself to still be a Jew. And so we know he must have meant something more specific than an entire dissolving of Jewish and Gentile identity. But even if you just continue to read the rest of the verse here, it says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Messiah, Yeshua. So when Paul says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, and that means like literally there's no Jew nor Gentile, then whoever's arguing from Galatians 3:28 in that way must also say that there's no such thing as male or female. But usually the people arguing against me usually don't want to go that far with it. But then even just from Paul's perspective, all throughout Paul's letters, he continues to refer to Jews, as we read in 1 Corinthians 7, and Gentiles as Gentiles. Romans 11, he'll literally say, I'm speaking to you, Gentiles. And of course, he refers to men and women, husband, wives, even slave and free in his letters as categories. Now, interestingly, in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, if you are a slave and you have the opportunity to become free, then become free. But that's kind of the only exception to the rule he gives of all these different identities. He never says, if you're a Jew but you can't become a Gentile, become a Gentile. Or he never says if you're a male and can't become a female, become a female. He never gives those exceptions. The only exception he gives is slave, you can become free. So that's kind of the exception that proves the rule that these other identities, Jew and Gentile, male and female, are as sturdy as he presumes them to be and treats them to be. So it's usually objections like that. And as Jonathan mentioned, Mark 7, and that's one of the things we talk about a lot on Two Messianic Jews, is addressing those passages that are used to object to our identity or our way of life. Jonathan's working on a video on Acts 10 right now, for example. So the vision that Peter gets, that people think that's where God abolished kosher law, for example, but Jonathan's going to show that that's not the case. There's actually a much more meaningful way of understanding that passage that's much more beautiful in describing Jew and Gentile unity in Messiah. So that's a great reason to subscribe to our stuff, because that's something we focus on a lot, is addressing those Christian objections to Messianic Judaism.
That is so good. Really good answers, you guys. I know for me personally, when I went to a Christian school growing up in elementary school, and a lot of people even high school and public school would come up to me and say, oh, you're not Jewish anymore because you believe in Jesus, so you're a Christian. And at that time, I'm only I'm a young girl and I have no idea what to say to them. So really learning what you believe and why is so important, especially as a Messianic Jew, because there are so many things thrown at you every day when people question who you are. At Bible studies, I get that all the time. If I join a church Bible study, they'll ask me, well, why do you follow the law? Why are you any bit observant? There's no Jew, no Gentile. And it's you almost, it just feels like you have to know a little bit of theology to stand up for what you believe in. But I used to see it as more of a burden. Now I see it more as a blessing, because there are people that want to learn. So Thank you, everyone that's still here. And we're going to get started with the last question, which is, and after this last question, if you guys are okay, Jonathan, Eric, to stay for like maybe 5 to 7 minutes to take some audience questions. Are you okay with time?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, perfect. So let's get started on question 5. How do you respond? This is a really loaded one. Okay. How do you respond to the claim that Messianic Jews are only practicing Judaism as a strategy to convert other Jews? Woo.
Yeah, I would say very, very succinctly, those people are not Messianic Jews. So a Messianic Jew, I'll read a definition from Dr. David Rudolph. Great book resource, Introduction to Messianic Judaism. He says, today, many people use the term Messianic Jew to refer to any Jewish believer in Yeshua, whereas the historic term connotes a Jew who believes in Yeshua and continues to live as a Jew as a matter of covenant, calling, or national duty before God. And so that's really important there, because the motivation for living as a Jew is not because we're trying to convert Jews to believe in Jesus. That's not at all the motivation. It's because it's part of our covenant, it's part of our calling, it's part of our duty before God. So the motivation for evangelism that's not the motivation. That's not the motivation for keeping Torah. And as Eric and I have expressed throughout this, that's neither of our motivation for the way we live as we do. Actually, so there's a Jewish believer I was doing some research on. His name is Rabbi Isaac Lichtenstein. So he's a Hungarian rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, who became a follower of Yeshua in the 1800s. And when he became a follower of Yeshua, and there was actually a tribunal in a rabbinical court where the court wanted him to kind of stop being public about his embracing of Yeshua as the Messiah, but if he's going to, just to become a Christian. Like they're saying, get baptized in the church. We don't want you to continue living this halakhic lifestyle, this practice where you're observant to the commandments. So it actually is more offensive for many Jewish people for us to continue to hold on to our identity as Jews and live in obedience to the Torah. And for many, they'd rather us just become Christians. But I don't see that at all in the scriptures that I hold. I see God calling me and all Jewish followers of Yeshua to hold on to their identity and live in a way that's consistent to a way of God calling the Jewish people to live as Jews.
Good answer.
Yeah, so that's kind of that is the best answer to it. As controversial as it may be, it is kind of getting into a debate over a definition of what Messianic Jew means. And I think historically this is the proper one when you look back to when the term Messianic Jew was first being used. We actually see it in the newsletter written by a South African Messianic Jew in 1910 is a newsletter literally called The Messianic Jew. And he understands a Messianic Jew, or at that time Hebrew Christian was kind of a synonym for this. But a Messianic Jew was somebody who resisted assimilating into the church. And so as a Jewish believer who resisted assimilation. And what that has meant has evolved over time since 1910 to where today it looks a lot more traditionally Jewish for Messianic Jews. But it is this resistance of assimilation into the church. So it's not merely a Jewish person who believes in Jesus. Mm-hmm. It is a Jewish person who follows Jesus and continues to assert their Jewish identity via their way of life. So anybody who is doing that simply as a missionary strategy, it does not qualify to meet that definition. That's more so just like a tactic that they are using, and it's not motivated by either a national commitment to being part of the Jewish people or obeying God's expectations for Jewish people or anything like that. It's for something other than, which takes them outside of that definition. So I'd still be willing to call them a Jewish follower of Yeshua, a Jewish disciple of Yeshua, but it would require a definition of Messianic Jew that I don't think makes much sense historically.
Those are great answers. I think that, personally, it sometimes seems like Christians are trying to get us to just start celebrating Easter and Christmas and just call ourselves Christians already. And then the Jews are telling us that we're not Jewish. So there's this constant rub, and you gotta have thick skin, I feel like, when you're a Messianic Jew, because it's just coming from all directions. And a lot of times we can feel very misunderstood. But that is why I am so thankful to have you guys as a resource with all the big questions and how you guys are able to explain it to a really good, I'm not going to say a 5-year-old level, but about a 10-year-old level. People can understand this because the way that you break it down. So I really appreciate that. Guys, before we get started on audience questions, go ahead and start commenting, by the way. Go ahead and follow these two men, okay? They are two Messianic Jews on YouTube and their podcasts. And you could also follow them on Instagram. It's the #2 Messianic Jews. So go ahead and give them a follow, listen to their stuff, give them 5-star reviews on their podcast because they're doing amazing work for God's kingdom. And go ahead with your questions, and I'll just start saying what they are, and then we'll get started. Tammy says, thank you. We'll follow.
If you'd like for us to clarify anything, feel free to ask clarification questions as well.
Don't you think the church should assimilate to how Yeshua lived as a Jew? Ooh, good question, Rachel. Okay, so she asked, don't you think the church should assimilate to how Yeshua lived as a Jew, no other way around?
Should the church assimilate, live as Jesus lived?
Yes,
Is that the question?
I think that's what she's asking. And I've gotten that question a lot. Should Christians start living as Messianic Jews? Is that even possible? Or Messianic?
So I think the scriptures are actually really, one, it's really cool. I think scriptures address this issue directly. And the answer to that question is clearly no. And we went to two of the main passages that discuss that. 1 Corinthians 7, for example, verse 18, was a man uncircumcised, or was a person a Gentile when he was called. He should not be circumcised. He should not become a Jew. And so if what that person means is, should all believers, Gentiles who come to believe in Jesus, should they start living like a Jewish person because Jesus was a Jew? Paul would push back against that in 1 Corinthians 7:18. And that was also the decision of the Acts 15 council, where it was not just Paul, but it was James, it was Peter, it was the elders in Jerusalem, the leaders of the initial community of Yeshua followers. And there the conclusion was, no, Gentiles do not need to become Jews. They do not need to keep the law of Moses. And this is particularly when it comes to Jewish specific things. So, of course, all believers in Yeshua should be like Yeshua in the sense of showing mercy, loving your neighbor, avoiding idolatry, do not steal, do not lie. They should be like Jesus like that. But there's really no evidence, and there's counter evidence to Gentiles wearing a talit, for example, or doing a Brit Milah, doing a ritual circumcision, or keeping the festivals, or keeping Shabbat, or keeping kosher. We actually see Paul in some ways discourage that sort of assimilation, so to speak. He thinks that he knows that there's value in being a Gentile. And I think a really beautiful passage about that is in Romans 15. So Romans 15, 7 and through 9, I think is a real great place to go to see that for Paul there's great theological value in Jewish identity and in Gentile identity within the body of Messiah. And that's because it glorifies God in a variety of ways. So in Romans 15, verse 7, it says, accept one another, then just as Messiah accepted you in order to bring praise to God. For I tell you that Messiah has become a servant of the Jews on behalf of God's truth, so that the promises made to the patriarchs might be confirmed. So Yeshua is an assurance to the Jewish people and to the whole, and for the whole world to notice that he kept the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the Jewish people. So Jews staying Jews within the body of Messiah is evidence that God is faithful to the Jewish people through Yeshua. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 9, and moreover, that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles, I'll sing the praises of your name. So Gentiles, being Gentiles in the body of Messiah, placing their trust in Yeshua, brings God glory because it's evidence to the whole world that God has mercy on the Gentiles as well. He's not just the God of the Jews, he's also the God of the Gentiles, which Paul talks about in Romans 3:29 through 30 beautifully. And then in the rest of Romans 15, Paul is talking about these, he lists these prophecies of Gentiles as Gentiles worshiping alongside Israel, the God of Israel. And so if all Gentiles became Jews upon believing in Yeshua, then God would just seem like the God of Jewish people only, and it would seem like only Jewish people worship the God of Israel. But if Gentiles stay Gentiles as they worship the God of Israel, then the whole world sees that the God of Israel is the God of the Jewish people and the God of the whole world, that he's the God of the entire, of all of humanity. And I think that's a really beautiful way to think about it. And that when we uphold the identities that God has assigned us, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7, we actually bring God glory, showing that he is the God of the entire world, the God of the Jewish people, the God of Israel, and the God of the nations. And we contribute to that glorification of God when we express our God-given identities as Jews or as Gentiles.
I'll add two things there. That's spot on. It is spot on. So if Gentiles needed to assimilate and become like Jesus, then that means they need to become circumcised. Because in Luke 2 verse 21, Jesus, Yeshua, was circumcised on the 8th day. He went through a Brit Milah. But Paul in Galatians 5 and 1 Corinthians 7 literally forbids Gentiles from becoming circumcised. So right there, the answer is plain and straightforward when you read just Paul's teaching on that. But also what Eric was talking about, how God is the God of the Jews and the Gentiles, and it really glorifies God by holding on to our identities and not assimilating into the camp that we're not, taking on an identity that we're not. In order for there, here's the point. In order for there to be unity, there needs to be distinction. If we need to become something that we're not, in order to become one, that erases the unity. When a man marries a woman, they don't become one gender. The man stays a man, the woman stays a woman, and they become united as one. The two shall become one flesh. So unity within the body of Messiah, Jew and Gentile, is something that is definitely emphasized in the New Testament, and it really glorifies God, as Eric showed us from Romans chapter 15.
That is so good. I think we're going to leave it there because that was a great high note. Thank you to Messianic Jews so much for being here. Guys, tap the screen and tell them how much you appreciate them being here. By the way, they have a YouTube and a podcast, to Messianic Jews, like TWO, and then their Instagram is #2 Messianic Jews. Everyone is saying thank you. I know you can't see the comments, but everyone is saying thank you and all the hearts. Should I have them back? Let me know if I should have them back. I think I should. Awesome. All right. Well, any last words? And also, how can we pray for you guys?
Let's see. So I'll be starting a doctoral program this summer. So prayers for successfully completing and starting that would be really great.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just prayers that God would continue to use us, and for the ministry that we're doing to be a resource for our Messianic community would continue to grow and help people in their spiritual journeys.
Great. That is so great. Well, we'll definitely be praying for you guys. Thank you again for being here. And we will sign off now. But thank you for being here, everybody that's been commenting with support and tapping the screen. You guys are amazing. Make sure you follow me for all the lives that I'm going to be doing with all different types of folks. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.